Our time is limited, but I want to briefly go back in time a little bit. I was here in 2000 for the funeral of your father. You assumed the position of president, and at that time, some people had real hopes for you as a reformer to change things, to bring more democracy to this country. In fact, however, critics and analysts said you pulled back. You pulled back to the point where now you were being branded other things than reformer. You were branded dictator and much worse. How does that make you feel? How does it make you feel when people say you, to use an American parlance, you've lost the plot? That is, you've lost the trail of what you might have done then that might have avoided all of this now.
Yeah. So first of all, if you want to talk about the hope, I always say I'm the hope of the Syrians. It doesn't matter if I'm the hope of any foreigner person, whether he's official or any other one. So all the terms that you've used in your question should be referred to the Syrian to see whether they agreed upon these terms or not. At the end, it's not about the term, it's about the content. It doesn't matter what they say, whether he's dictator or reformer. Today you have propaganda. Do they say the same word about their allies in the Gulf states? Do they talk about the dictatorship in the Gulf states?
We're talking about Syria now.
Yeah, I know, but I have the right to answer about the other regime or other states, that they are much far from democracy than the Syrian state. Going back to your question, the reform is not the job of certain person in a country, whether the president or the government or the people. The president and the government can lead the reform, but the reform is a social process. It's a social process, and it's influenced by many different things, including the external factors. Whether you have a war, whether you have stability, whether you have better economic conditions, whether you have very bad ideologies coming from abroad. So talking about the reform in the way that I presented at the very beginning, and I still believe in the same concept and values and principle, you should have democracy that reflects our own traditions. But democracy is not a goal, it's a means to reach the prosperity. And democracy based on accepting the other. When you have a closed ideology and many taboos that prevent you from accepting the other cultures in your country, you are going backward. Doesn't matter what the president do in that regard. Not the constitution, not the law, not any other process can make the democracy real one, realistic one in such a society. Only when the society makes this democracy, you can talk about it. It's a culture. So I'm still a reformer. I still believe in the same values. But if you go back to the history of the last decades, the most complicated situations happening in our region, this is one of the reasons why the democracy, not in Syria, in the whole region, is going backward. We are going farther from democracy, not closer.
But again, to stay with your country and to stay with a little bit of recent history, move back just 2.5 years ago this week. That was the first protests here in this country. People said that was still a sign that people were unhappy, your own Syrian people, about your moves to democracy, and that was simply what they were asking for: more democracy, more reform. They weren't even asking for you to step down at that time.
Right.
Critics will say you moved in too hard, too fast, with tanks, targeting protesters, torturing, etc., etc. That is the critique of yours, and you once again missed another chance. How do you feel about that 2.5 years on?
That's a very simple question. If you want to oppress those people because we don't accept their request, why did the president himself, I said in one of my speeches at the very beginning of the conflict, why did I have to say publicly that those people have legitimate demand? This is first. Second, if we are going to use the force, why did we change the constitution? Why did we change the law? Why did we have now more than 15 new parties in Syria, political party? Why did we change so many laws that they asked for? Because we knew that it wasn't about democracy. If they asked for democracy, how did they kill some of those people? I'm not generalizing. Some demonstrators demonstrated for the reason that you've mentioned, but some others, they killed soldiers and they killed policemen in the first week of the conflict. What's the relation between asking for democracy and killing and assassinating? So we have to be very precise in differentiating between people who ask for democracy and terrorists. This is first. Second, part of those people who were opposing the government at the very beginning, today they support the government against the terrorists. Because they ask for reform, but they didn't ask for terrorists. So you are talking about two different completely situations between the beginning of the conflict and today. So we're still moving forward in the path of the democracy. And part of the solution that I just mentioned a few minutes ago, when we sit around the table, the Syrian people will say, what's the best constitution? What's the best political system? Do they want it parliamentarian, presidential, quasi-presidential, and so on? So what laws do they want? Everything. So it's not the president who's going to set. If the people want to set up their new system, this is democracy.
But you bring up a point that leads to my next question. Some people will say that you have just waged a war of attrition. That is, that you have waited and ground people down. And some of those that felt very peacefully that they wanted a change here in democracy, now after 2.5 years of fighting, they're willing to give in a little bit. And at the outset, you talked about terrorists coming inside, and now you've allowed, or you've created a situation on the ground because of this long period for the terrorists to come here. My point is, you're not really changing people's minds, you're just forcing them into this box where we're 2.5 years on, we're 110,000 people dead, cities in ruins, and you're hoping that your people will just surrender to the idea. I mean, is that really where you wanted to go with this whole thing?
So the core of the idea that I created the atmosphere to invite terrorists to Syria.
You held on long enough. You held on long enough against the demands of people who wanted peaceful demands for
from
democracy.
the very beginning we accepted the demands. From the very beginning
you
we
accepted the demands.
From the very beginning, before the terrorists, all those foreigners coming to Syria, from the very beginning, in 2011, 2 months after 6 days after the conflict, we said we were going to change, and we started the process of changing the constitution 2 or 3 months after the beginning, and we had the vote. I mean, the people. I didn't change the constitution. The people voted, or let's say there was a referendum, and the people voted in that referendum for this new constitution. At the beginning of 2012, in February, before the end of 1 year of the conflict. So what you're saying is far cry from reality. It's completely different story. It's not none of these things happening in Syria. It's about maybe another country. What happened in Syria from the very beginning, we said we are ready. If there's any demand, we are ready to change everything. So what could the president do, or how could he succeed if the people are against him? How can he succeed? Just you want to be president just for the sake of being president? That's not realistic. It's impossible.
Do your tactics in this war, do you back your tactics in this war? I mean, a year ago we stood in Homs, one of your great cities, and we watched as your artillery, which was lined up around the outskirts of the city, pound again and again, relentlessly, the center of the city. You say you're going for the enemy, you say you're going for the terrorists, but that, some will call it indiscriminate shelling, has left many civilians dead, and frankly has left that city and many of your other great cities like Aleppo and others in ruins. I mean, is this the way to go after, if you think there are some terrorists out there, the terrorist enemies of your state?
So it's like if you say that when the terrorists infiltrated some area or attack certain part of any city, that the civilians would stay and live with them. That's impossible. Whenever the terrorists enter an area, the civilians would leave, unless they use them as a human shield. But in most of the cases, the civilians would quit their area because of the terrorists. And that's why you have so many refugees. So in most of the cases, the Syrian army attack area where there's no civilians living in it. In most of the cases, you can hardly find civilians with terrorists. They cannot live.
With a rough estimate, Mr. President, of the total of 110,000 dead so far is at least about 50,000 civilians. You're saying there were 50,000 human shields? You're saying that those people were in the wrong place?
First of all, what's the source of your information?
That is a breakdown by analysts who look at these numbers. You think it's lower?
Analysts from the United States, living in the United States or living around, you can only talk about facts. We cannot talk about estimations and allegations.
110,000 is a fact that everyone agrees with.
Of course, as I said, we have tens of thousands of dead. I didn't say the exact number for one reason, because we have thousands of missing people. You cannot count them as dead. They do not that they are dead. It's a war now. So talking about the number, we have to be very precise. You're talking about the numbers as spreadsheet, without knowing that they are family. This is tragedy. We live with those people. This is a human tragedy. It's not about numbers. It's about every family in Syria lost a dear one, including my family. We lost a member of family. We lost friends. And that's why we are fighting terrorism. So should we allow the terrorists to continue without fighting them? This number, if it's close to the real number, will be so many folds, will be millions, not hundreds of thousands.
We don't want to get lost in numbers because, as you say, it's very true, a human issue here. But again, you use the figure of 90% of the opposition, the rebels, are Al-Qaeda. You stand by that, 90%.
80 to 90. No one has exact number. You don't have the exact number because they are coming, flowing irregularly.
You don't think that's too high? I mean, people are putting that lower, at least 50-50, and one would say that if at least it's 50-50, you have some opposition to deal with.
Which people? I'm sure not the Syrian people. No one in Syria say they are 50-50. From abroad, maybe. They have their own estimations. But at the end, it's our conflict. We live here. It's our country. We can tell how much. But 50-50, how did they count it?
But again, just to sum up what you've been saying, in one quote you said, the opposition has been manufactured from abroad. Do you really feel that? You really feel the opposition in this country to your government has been manufactured from abroad?
It's not feeling, and it's not about how I feel. It's about what facts are presented in front of us. If they don't have Syrian grassroots, because we have oppositions in Syria that they have grassroots. Why to have opposition abroad? How do they live? Who give them money? How they are financed? And we all know that they belong to some to the United States and Britain and France and Qatar and Saudi Arabia. Real opposition only belongs to the Syrian people. As long as it doesn't belong to its people, it's made by other countries. That's simple evidence.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Dennis.